Ukraine is facing even more challenges following the fall of Avdiivka and with the ongoing battle in Congress. We're going to discuss the fundraiser for drones and equipment, which will help hopefully alleviate some of these shortfalls. However, we're also going to talk about how these fundraisers aren't really enough and how there's really a true cost being paid right now to Ukrainian aid being held up in Congress and in other European countries right now. We're also going to discuss how Ukraine is still managing to hold back Russian forces, at least so far. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about the implications of aid to Ukraine being held back, because this also impacts Taiwan as well as another potential conflict. And we just need to be real about what all is at stake here. I'm recording this video on February 26, 2024. So first I want to talk about this fundraiser. I mean, there was a fundraiser by a number of Ukrainian supporters with large followings on Twitter and as well as on several other platforms. And their goal is to raise money for a fleet of unmanned sea drones. These are the kinds of sea drones that you've seen footage of likely if you've seen, Ukraine targeting the Black Sea Fleet. They're trying to expand Ukraine's fleet of these vehicles so they can continue to target the Black Sea Fleet. Their goal, of course, was to raise $221,000 each to convert into that sea of unmanned drones. So far to this point, 14 Black Sea Fleet ships have been destroyed, including some pretty high-profile targets, including the capital ship Moskva. You'll remember that from several months ago. Similar kinds of fundraisers have been raised as well. Lithuania just had a national fundraiser which raised about 8.3 million euros to outfit Ukrainian troops with basic personal protective equipment like helmets and body armor, as well as different kinds of equipment for their weapons and for their helmet, like night vision goggles and that kind of stuff. So these fundraisers aren't necessarily uncommon. We've seen those before. There's definitely been a lot of fundraisers for drones. Especially those small little quadcopters that we see getting used, getting FPV drones in the hands of the warfighter. And those have become incredibly effective. And because of their, relative cheap price, that has helped Ukraine to have, accurate lethality, I guess, to use a buzzword, against, the incoming Russians. However, again, we're talking about just massive quantities of these devices being needed, especially to make up for the shortfall in artillery ammunition. So there's really a lot of work to be done, and these fundraisers aren't necessarily going to be enough. But the Sea Drone fundraiser kind of came alongside a threat by General Kirilo Budanov, who's the head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, to the Kerch Strait Bridge. He warned civilians not to use it. And we've seen Ukraine kind of directly threaten the Kerch Strait Bridge multiple times since the war started. We've also seen them target the Kerch Strait Bridge. It's an incredibly important strategic target for Ukraine because it allows Russia to reinforce and supply its forces in Crimea as well as in Zaporizhia. Of course, it's got both a rail bridge and a highway that connects Crimea to mainland Russia. So if Ukraine's able to target that bridge and collapse it, that really puts Russia in a challenging position where they're going to have to fix it. But until it's operational, again, they're going to have to use, airlift, sea lift, or even the land bridge in Zaporizhia to resupply its forces in Sevastopol and, Greater Crimea. So these are, some of the high-profile fundraisers that we've seen, especially recently. And sea, of course, has been a high-profile element of the war, but it hasn't necessarily been a decisive part of the war. We haven't, we saw like a seaborne attack on the city of Mariupol. However, since then we haven't seen one. There was concern at the outset of the war that Odessa would also see, some sort of an amphibious attack, but we never saw that. And with how much of a beating that the Black Sea Fleet has been taking, I would be shocked if we really saw what's left of the Black Sea Fleet try to launch anything against a city like Odessa. This really gives Ukraine the ability to target the Black Sea Fleet, get kind of more of a moral or a psychological victory. It's good for propaganda, but it doesn't necessarily change the situation on the ground, which is getting bad. It's getting very, very bad, especially, and we've talked about aid to Ukraine. We're going to talk about that more in this video. It's going to get worse as aid, continues to get delayed and held up. In a recent speech, President Zelensky stated that over 31,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed since the outset of the war. And this has been after 2 years of war. and he did not give a figure on the number of injuries, which is likely much higher. I mean, some models will project out, injuries are about 3 times that of wounded or of those killed. So based on the 31,000 number, that's probably 93,000 wounded. However, Zelensky's statement was also disputed by other even pro-Ukrainian sources. Some saying that 42,000 troops have been verifiably killed. So that's even itself kind of a low number because we're talking about verifiable deaths. Of course, in war, you're going to have a lot of folks killed, unfortunately, that people can't necessarily identify or track down. And so they're either labeled as missing or captured until a later point whenever they can be identified. And so 42,000 is still a pretty huge number. And Zelensky also stated that over 180,000 Russians have been killed, which I think is an insanely high number in that direction. And I haven't really seen much support for that number necessarily based on other sources. Russia is believed, based on say British intelligence and some other sources on the outside, they're believed to have suffered somewhere between 350,000 to 400,000 total casualties, which includes killed and wounded. So for, Ukraine, of course, if it wasn't last week, then it was a little bit before that. We talked about how Russia had suffered more losses than it lost in Afghanistan just for the city of Avdiivka. And of course, there's the Battle of Bakhmut before that, and several other battles before that even that had really just been very attritional. Right now, the war is incredibly attritional, where Russia is just sending wave after wave of attack, and they're getting just beaten down, but Russia's not stopping. And that's really where the ammunition problem comes in for Ukraine. It's not that Ukraine's having a hard time defending itself in general, it's having a hard time resupplying its pretty strong defense. And it doesn't matter how strong your defense is, if you don't have the ammunition, then you're just not going to do it. So this is really where the friction is starting to come in for Ukraine, especially with its European and U.S. supporters. It needs more ammunition, and it needs more ammunition that really, I think we're really able to comprehend at this point. Some figures have stated that Ukraine is consuming up to 30,000 rounds of ammunition a month, or 30,000 rounds of artillery a month, which is quite a lot, and that's way more than even here in the United States, our current production capacity can sustain. And that's just for Ukraine. We're not even talking about if anything breaks out over Taiwan. I have opinions about whether or not we're going to need that much artillery in Taiwan, but we can talk about that in a later video. But the situation is going to continue to get worse as Russia continues its advances, especially to the west of Avdiivka. They're continuing to assault near the city of Robotna to attack that Ukrainian salient that we discussed last time. And it's going to be this is kind of shaping up to be that next significant face-off between Ukraine and Russia in that little pocket there in Zaporizhia. The burden is really kind of getting on the United States to pass that supplemental package for Ukraine. And it's currently held up in Congress. There's some other issues that are kind of getting tied to it. Those of you that are kind of unfamiliar with U.S. Congress and kind of how it works, if you're watching from Europe, the Congress really loves to package different interests. So if, person A wants a supplemental deal passed for Ukraine and person B wants a support package for Israel, then they'll both agree to vote in favor of a package if they combine their interests together. So the package includes both. However, of course, Israel is a little bit of a more polarizing subject than Ukraine is. Of course, people are still talking about, supporting Taiwan. They want to get support to Taiwan. And so that's become one of the very important supplemental packages here in this foreign aid package that's currently being held up. And of course, the border is, always a huge topic in U.S. politics. So these are kind of some of the things that are kind of getting all roped into and haggled over in the support deal. And unfortunately, Ukrainian aid is just kind of sitting there waiting to be passed. The majority of people agree that it needs to get passed. It's just kind of being packaged in there with a deal that not everybody can necessarily agree on, and it hasn't really been stripped off into its own little supplemental deal and passed on its own before the rest can be sent out. So it's a bit of it's political haggling. It's silly, and it's costing a lot of lives right now. To hammer this point home, and I'm not going to show the footage here, obviously, you're free to find the tweet and view it for yourself. if that's something that you want to do, to see that I'm not just making this up, like it's a real thing. But as the Russians have advanced, west of Avdiivka and taken Ukrainian positions, they've been capturing Ukrainians. And, a normal country, and I say a normal country, a country that adheres to the Geneva Conventions, they will take prisoners of war, they will move them away from the front line, and then they will protect them. Prisoners of war are afforded certain protections under the Geneva Convention that, it even includes cigarettes. Under the Geneva Conventions, you get a box of cigarettes. And, they are protected in a rear, holding facility. And they cannot be tortured. They cannot be executed. Obviously, they, can be used in prisoner exchange deals. And we've seen that since the war started. There have been prisoner exchange deals. But the images and the videos that have been coming out from Avdiivka, from west of Avdiivka, is the Russians are just executing the Ukrainians on the spot. They're taking them prisoner for just a few moments and then shooting them right then and there. And it's all getting captured on drone footage, and as well as images that are being released by the Russian soldiers themselves. There have been some statements from civilians evacuating Avdiivka that had been there whenever the Russians seized the town, and they were able to get out before it got too bad. But they, also kind of verified that Russian soldiers are out there looting civilian homes. They're harassing and killing civilians. They're shooting Ukrainian soldiers. It's very bad, and this is the cost of what's happening whenever Ukraine runs out of ammunition. Again, these soldiers aren't losing the will to fight. They're losing the ability to fight. The will still is there, and they just can't do it because they're running out of artillery ammunition. They're running out of small arms ammunition. They're running out of tank rounds. It's becoming a real problem, and that's going to pose a lot of challenges for Ukraine, especially in the months that go into springtime and summer, whenever the ground hardens. Right now, of course, you have the muddy season, so that kind of holds down offenses. But as the weather begins to harden, that's going to become a problem. That's going to become a real problem. If you're not familiar with the city of Bucha, north of Kiev, during the initial phase of the war, that's another example of what has been happening whenever the Russians have basically seized territory and how they're trying to consolidate their hold on certain areas. They're just shooting people in the street. It appears that that's still something that they're doing right now. So this isn't about, politics. It's not about left versus right, or, liberal or conservative. It's about, good and evil. And what's going on is truly evil, and it has to be stopped. But we're still, there's still luckily some time, at least for now. Ukraine's still fighting. We've talked about Rabotna and Zaporizhia and how that is continuing to be, shaping up to be a large battle here coming up. Ukraine's going to have to continue to trade space for time. And the more space that they trade, the more we're probably going to be seeing, Ukrainian troops that are kind of left behind being killed. As well as Ukrainian civilians losing their homes and their livelihoods, and also potentially their lives. It's not. This isn't about politics. It's about right versus wrong. We've seen Ukraine still, have some successes, specifically with, HIMARS. They hit some pretty large troop concentrations a few times in this past week, but it is becoming a very significant challenge for Ukraine overall across the greater front. And artillery, as well as other forms of ammunition. Now, there are several implications for aid to Ukraine being held up. I mean, we're not just talking about, Ukrainian troops being killed. We're not only talking about war crimes and, dislocated civilians. We're also talking about the implications for other theaters that a war could break out in the near future. First, still talking about Ukraine here. Should Ukraine fall, Europe will likely face millions to tens of millions of displaced civilians fleeing Russian occupation. And, we've already kind of seen a lot of news and a lot of controversy in Europe over the handling of asylum seekers and refugees from the Middle East. And that was a large quantity of them that were fleeing conflict in the Middle East for safety in Europe. Well, it's going to get way worse if you throw in millions and tens of millions of Ukrainians into that mix as well. And it can be prevented. It can all be prevented. You just got to give Ukraine the tools to fight and win. They have the willpower. They've had momentum at certain parts of this conflict. It's just about right now equipping them to freeze the Russian advance and even push them back. But beyond the displaced civilian challenge, Europe will have to deal with whatever Russia does next. They certainly would feel emboldened if they were able to, over a 2-year time or a 3-year time, take over the country of Ukraine. Their thesis of victory had proven correct, that, the West didn't have the willpower, the political fortitude to stand up against Russia. And now Russia can do whatever it wants to do next. It has Ukraine, so where else does it want to go? Of course, we've talked about Moldova. Last video, I misspoke and said Moldova was a NATO ally. It's not. It has a region called Transnistria that Russia has had its eyes on for a very long time. That could be next if Russia is able to connect it with a land bridge. And there's of course Kaliningrad. The Cold War concern was always the Fulda Gap, and of course now it's the Slovakia Gap connecting Kaliningrad and Russia. I hope I said that right. That's not the Slovakia Gap, is it? That is the Slovakia Gap. I said that right. Sometimes I misspeak. It happens, But like I said already, the implications aren't just limited to Ukraine. It's been said many times, and we've talked about it in some of my past videos, not necessarily on this channel, but on the other main one, that there is no larger audience to the war in Ukraine than Xi Jinping. And I would argue, I'd be willing to bet that the second largest audience behind him is probably Taiwan. Nobody is watching how the West reacts to that war more than China and Taiwan is right now. And should, the United States and NATO fail to provide Ukraine with the aid that it needs to defend itself, who's to say that Taiwan turns out any different? In fact, Taiwan's in kind of a worse position because of geography. It's, of course, closer to China than it is other folks, but it can be isolated more easily. It's not like Russia can blockade Taiwan, or, it's not like Russia can blockade Ukraine and prevent aid from entering into the country. China most certainly can do that. It has that capability. It has a navy strong enough to isolate the island and prevent, any other navy from coming in, including arguably the United States Navy, which might kind of come across as heresy, but China has built out some pretty significant capabilities over recent years, specifically to deny area and to deny access to areas to other countries. Specifically, we're talking the United States. From a pretty robust and broad anti-ship ballistic missile fleet and suite to 3 different aircraft carriers and other kinds of ships, all designed to keep the U.S. Navy at bay. So that is going to be a significant challenge for Taiwan. It's not about necessarily getting aid to Taiwan during the war. It's more about getting aid to Taiwan before it starts. To hopefully make it as challenging as possible for China to seize the island. Of course, Taiwan's geography poses its own challenges for an invading force, but now we're getting a little bit into the weeds. The point is that if aid to Ukraine falters, then Xi Jinping might see that as a sign that the same can be done in Taiwan, and that will open opportunities for him. And we're still going to have to deal with Putin on the opposite end of that decision as well. Putin might look at Transnistria and see that, Moldova is not a NATO ally, just like Ukraine wasn't. And so they can take Transnistria, no problem. And then, what about the Baltics? I mean, they are NATO allies. If NATO didn't have the intestinal fortitude to stand up to Russia whenever it had its best chance in Ukraine, then who's to say that it'll stand up to Russia in the Baltics? That's a bit more of a dramatic statement, and I would be shocked if Russia went after NATO proper, but, Transnistria is kind of that next in line, concern. So there's a lot riding in Ukraine and with the supplemental bill that's currently sitting in Congress, and there's a lot riding in future aid packages to Ukraine. We saw in Afghanistan what happened whenever a well-motivated military that was well-equipped ran out of its logistical support. It wasn't that the Afghan National Army didn't have the motivation or the will to fight the Taliban. They certainly did, and they fought to the end. They just ran out of bullets. They couldn't support the fight itself. And it was incredibly shocking. I'm sure we can all remember how shocking it was to see how quickly the Taliban was able to get into Kabul and consolidate its gains and take over Afghanistan. Well, the same thing can happen here in Ukraine. It's not that the Ukrainians don't have the willpower to fight Russia. They certainly do. And they'll probably continue to fight Russia using insurgent-style tactics following an occupation. However, this is their best chance to beat Russia right now, while they have a standing military that's large, well-equipped, and capable. They just need ammunition. That's all they need. And, you know, here in the United States, we call ourselves the arsenal of democracy. Well, we have a democracy that's fighting itself against an autocracy that is not willing to follow international law. It is willing to kill prisoners of war and civilians just to make a point. That's something that has to be stood up to. So anyway, I wanted to talk about that because this is something that's kind of it's shocking to me that it's become a debate, you know, an argument. And I recognize, you know, there are several polls out there showing that, you know, most Americans recognize the importance of the war in Ukraine. So it's really a very loud minority that is arguing against the war in Ukraine, and a lot of that, of course, is boosted by, you know, bots and different, you know, kinds of disinformation actors, a lot of by Russia, to kind of prevent aid and kind of increase confusion about what's going on. I understand that most Americans and Europeans agree that, you know, aid needs to get to Ukraine, but it's just kind of like how it's not happening even despite that fact, and it's, you know, kind of becoming bottlenecked by just a handful of individuals at this point, and that's becoming very frustrating to see. Not just because it's an important thing just in general, but because we're starting to see, you know, in our face, the impact of that aid being held up. You know, we're seeing individuals losing their lives because they ran out of ammunition. You know, they were still ready to fight, but you know, they just weren't getting supported the way that they needed to. Let me know your thoughts on all of this down below. I really want to hear your opinion on this. You know, do you think something different? You know, sound that off down below. Leave a like if you found this video helpful, and we will talk next time. Later.